Anthony. Thanks for coming back to my channel. Let's jump right in with my 15th D.B. Cooper comment question and answer video. Fred writes about Ted Braden and Robert Rackstraw. Both of these characters have military backgrounds and criminal records that make them look like potentially likely candidates for the Cooper skyjacking. Not a lot of photos of Ted Braden, although in the ones that I've seen he has darker skin, just as Cooper was described as having, and Braden lived in Portland, Oregon at the time. I don't know that much about him, but I wouldn't entirely write him off as being a good potential candidate. Let's look at Rackstraw for a minute. So remember what Cooper was described as looking like. And here's a picture of Rackstraw. It looks like a mugshot, but actually it's just a military ID picture. In general, I say it looks like a pretty good match. But let's look at other people who have been proposed as candidates. Here's Sheridan Peterson. A lot of people would say pretty good match there. Here's Kenny Christensen, not a really good match in my mind, but many people think that it's an excellent match. Of course, here's the known skyjacker, Richard Floyd McCoy, somebody who many people believe was Cooper. In my mind, not a very good match, especially with the prominent ears that stick out, which have evidently caused him to have the nickname Dumbo, although partisans of the Cooper-McCoy theory believe that his picture is a perfect match. Of course, here is Vince Peterson, whom science is pointing towards. Not too bad of a match, although somehow in his later life he naturally gets fuller hair and parts his hair on the opposite side of his head, which men typically do not do. Some people think that Joe Lockitch was Cooper. Here's a comparison, but the right-hand side, which I assume is supposed to be Cooper, obviously has been touched up to look more like the left-hand side. So just on the face of it, we have a lot of candidates who look, to some degree, somewhat like the sketch artist rendering of Cooper. Many of these people had a military background or some paratrooping or skydiving experience. Some of them had shady backgrounds, whether potentially from the CIA or they were just shady criminals or both. Each of them have documentaries, movies, or books that have been put out. But when one looks at only the evidence that the proponents present, each candidate seems to look like they might realistically be Cooper. But is that enough? Many of the pictures of these different candidates have been shown to the flight attendant who was there the night of the skyjacking, and they discount the ones that they've been shown as not being the person that called himself Dan Cooper. But what about Rackstraw? Here again is what we believe to be a photo of him. It certainly looks legitimate, and I don't think that anyone's contested that this was him in 1970, about a year before the skyjacking. But here he is in the 1970s, a few years later, after being arrested in Iran and brought back to the United States. That individual, who is Robert Rackstraw, does not look at all like D.B. Cooper. If anything, he looks like Paul Giamatti. And here's another picture of Rackstraw, I'm guessing probably from the 1980s or 90s, wearing a military uniform containing a rank, at least one patch, and a number of ribbons that he was not entitled to. Again, it does not look like somebody who has that much in common facially with what Cooper was described to look like. Did Rackstraw have the background to do what Cooper did? I think so. But so did a lot of other people. McCoy seems to have had a very similar background. So did Braden. Lots of people did. Was he somehow, or someone with a criminal background who would have likely done something like this? He does seem to fit that mold. It's pretty clear that he probably killed his stepfather. He was involved in all kinds of crimes, including trying to fake his own death. Trying to make a quick score by hijacking a plane for $200,000 doesn't seem to be out of the realm of something he might do. So, he had the ability to carry out the crime. He potentially had the motive, but does that make him Cooper? No, because again, Braden had the same motive and opportunity, McCoy had the same motive and opportunity, and of course there's others. It's reported by people that Rackstraw insinuated that he was Cooper to a degree, but it's also pointed out that when he was specifically asked if he was Cooper, he denied it. Why would he insinuate that he was Cooper if he wasn't? Because he's a criminal. He's a liar. Liars lie about things. D.B. Cooper has become a folk hero. Why wouldn't somebody who fits the Cooper mold not lie about it if he could get people to think that he was Cooper and have gotten away with it? But if he was Cooper, and he obviously survived the 1971 skyjacking, then what happened to the money? Why didn't he maintain control of it? It seems that he had no great source of wealth after Thanksgiving 1971. From what I've heard, it sounds like he had various businesses, all of which failed, including the last one that he had, a boat repair business that failed after he got quote-unquote unmasked by Tom Colbert as being Cooper. Rackstraw even is quoted in one online source claiming to have been offered $40 million for his participation in a film. Now let's think about that for a minute. Tom Cruise probably makes less than $40 million for one of his blockbusters. Is Robert Rackstraw, at the time a homeless, unemployed veteran, going to be paid $40 million for his life story, assuming that he was D.B. Cooper? I highly doubt it. So more evidence that nothing, one way or the other, that he said can be trusted with any certainty. I know that there is a whole story about him having accomplices and that they supposedly gave a hippie family some money to supposedly find a Tina Bar, which supposedly was Brian Ingram's family, who of course found a little bit of the money in 1980. Again, after the fact, one can come up with all kinds of stories, but even that one doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Rackstraw wasn't even really a suspect until that time, and finding a little bit of money is not going to necessarily persuade the FBI to change their opinion and think that Cooper had now died, when they had all along thought that the likelihood was that he had perished in the Columbia River. So this money really is not any type of alibi that would protect Rackstraw. But these are some great questions and comments because they do bring up something that needs to be reinforced with the Cooper case. There are many candidates who look good on paper for this case, many people with the ability and motive to potentially carry out the skyjacking. Despite one or more retired FBI agents or private investigators or former CIA officials, or other law enforcement or government bureaucrats who may write books or help produce movies, no more than one of these men could have been Cooper. And again, as I've said in other videos, I think it's likely that Cooper perished, so none of these suspects could have been Cooper because they all survived past Thanksgiving 1971. But we need to be very cautious when we watch one video or read one book proposing one candidate and then think, case closed, that's it. Because these books and documentaries never point out the multitude of evidence which would tend to not incriminate their candidate. So, thank you very much for your comments here. Let's move on to the next comment. It's about an older video that I did. Actually, I've done two. One was called D.B. Cooper. Was Kenny Christensen really the hijacker? And the other I made was called the 5 Top Reasons that D.B. Cooper was not Kenny Christensen. Anyway, the commenter agrees with me that Kenny Christensen was not the skyjacker, who referred to himself as Dan Cooper. For people who believe that Christensen was Cooper, it's usually because they saw the pseudo-documentary on the History Channel. Unfortunately, so many shows on the History Channel have become just absolute mindless garbage. One of the key pieces of evidence from that side says that soon after the skyjacking, Kenny Christensen, who supposedly was a poor airline employee, bought a house with cash. That is absolutely not true, and people have found copies of the financial paperwork concerning the house purchase, and it shows that it took him something like 19 years to pay off his mortgage. I don't have the image of that document handy, but I have it in one or more of my other videos, so check those out if you have any interest in the Kenny Christensen D.B. Cooper connection. And then our next comment is from Dan Stafford, concerns the tie, which I've done many videos about. He states that forensic science can retrieve fingerprints off the tie. I would say that if you purchased a tie that came sealed up in cellophane, and you opened it up and touched the tie repeatedly, and then it was fingerprinted, that it's possible that usable fingerprints could be lifted. In the case of the Cooper tie, that's not really being considered as far as I've seen. If you've seen videos of FBI Special Agent Carr handling the tie, I believe he's wearing gloves. Citizen sleuths are wearing gloves. But I'm sure that when the flight attendant picked up the tie and gave it to the FBI, they may not have been wearing gloves. When you watch videos of the money being handled originally, you see people touching it with their bare hands. I may even have seen FBI agents in a video touching the money with their bare fingers after it was retrieved. So concerns about lifting possible fingerprints off of the tie probably were never considered, and it's probably been contaminated with plenty of other fingerprints by this time. Here's another comment from Dan Stafford suggesting that Cooper was Canadian based on a couple things: the name, and also that he requested the money in, quote, negotiable American currency. The name Dan Cooper could have come from a Franco-Belgian comic book about a Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot named Dan Cooper. Now, the name could well have been a total coincidence, although I think that there is a distinct possibility that there could have been a connection. Just because the character was a Canadian, we have to remember that the comic book was published in France, and at a time in Belgium also, for French-speaking audiences of both of those countries. It's unlikely that a Canadian would necessarily have known about the comics, and unless they had been stationed in Europe, then they might have. But that could also apply to Americans who were also stationed in, say, the NATO headquarters in Brussels or something like that. Some people pointed out that somebody could have brought back the copies from Belgium or France and that they circulated in Quebec, although there isn't any evidence of this. But again, it's a possibility. Requesting the money in negotiable American currency is a strange phrase and has led many people, including myself, to question whether Cooper was not an American but perhaps a Canadian, and I've discussed that in a number of other videos. I think that is certainly a possibility, although I got a lot of pushback from viewers who argue that despite all their efforts, even Canadians on the west coast of their country have a hard time keeping Canadianisms out of their speech patterns. Things like ending the sentence with a. I used to work with a Canadian from Vancouver, BC. He was educated, at least at the graduate level in the United States, but you could still tell he was from Canada. At least I could. Would Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant, have been able to pick up such subtleties if they existed? Who knows? But I do not think that we can entirely rule out a Canadian connection based on these and other factors. Another factor is that criminals tend to commit crimes near to where they live. Obviously, if this was a Canadian who lived in Canada, say British Columbia, and they had some grudge against the United States, skyjacking a plane from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington is probably the closest that they're going to get to Canada while still committing the crime in the United States. So very good observation there. The next comment is about who may have disappeared at the time of the skyjacking. This is another question that I've commented upon many other times in videos, but it's an important one. Although it looks like the FBI dropped the ball a lot in this case, if you look through the actual files that have been released, they were following up on all kinds of leads and clues and tips from the public. Ultimately, they concluded that he likely died during the jump, quite possibly in the Columbia. After watching Dan Gryder's first video and thinking that Richard Floyd McCoy was Cooper, and then getting set straight by many of my viewers, thinking about the whole situation, I've also come to the conclusion that the likelihood is that Cooper probably waited to jump until he could see the lights of the Vancouver-Portland metropolitan area and jumped, and intentionally or unintentionally ended up in the Columbia River. Perhaps his parachute opened, perhaps it didn't. The money being found in the sand at the beach called Tina Bar would seem to support this, but of course, even that is hotly disputed within the Cooper sphere. Now, I'm not so close-minded that I don't think that he could have survived, and perhaps he lost a little bit of the money, but retained the rest of it, or he lost all of the money, but still survived. But if we go under the assumption that the FBI and I and others believe that he perished in November 1971, then none of the suspects that have been brought forward could have been Cooper because they all survived past that time. So therefore, under my assumption, Cooper was somebody who basically disappeared on November 24th, 1971, and was never heard from again. So, wouldn't that cause people to report a missing coworker? You would think so. But as I also point out, Cooper may not have been employed at that time. A lot of people point out that for Cooper to do what he did, he probably was in desperate financial straits. This seems to be the case of Richard Floyd McCoy, probably the situation of Ted Braden. So, if our unknown Cooper suspect was unemployed and desperate and skyjacked the plane for money, and assuming he didn't survive, there is no job for him to show up to after the long Thanksgiving weekend, so nobody reporting him. It's not out of the realm of possibility that he was married, and we see that with Richard Floyd McCoy, but I think that the likelihood is that he probably wasn't married. as we might expect that his wife or presumably widow would say, "Hey, my husband disappeared and he looks a lot like Dan Cooper and I haven't heard from him since Thanksgiving Eve." Now, of course, that may not necessarily have happened. In a number of my videos, I talk about the Somerton man, a case in Australia, as informative for looking at the Cooper case. Very briefly, the body of a man who likely died of poisoning was found on Somerton Beach. He had no money or ID on him. Eventually, a lot of unusual clues and connections to local people were found, possibly indicating participation in a Soviet espionage ring, possibly having been liquidated by the Soviets. But as it turns out, he was a lonely divorced man, possibly looking for his ex-wife, and giving up, he went to the beach and took his own life. And this has been demonstrated through DNA testing now. So the mystery really has been solved, except for the mystery of why his ex-wife never noticed that her ex-husband had become the most famous unsolved death in the country, but perhaps she just didn't read the newspapers, never make the connection. And in the United States, we would think that there would be a coordinated effort for tracking missing people, but as we've seen over the years, if you look at true crime stories in the United States, because we have different layers of federal, state, county, and other local law enforcement, and a division of what is a federal crime and what is not a federal crime, there has not been a clear coordination to compiling all of these statistics, especially when the skyjacking took place over 50 years ago. I think if any usable DNA is able to be obtained from the clip-on tie, or if the cigarette butts are ever located, then DNA testing of them and genetic genealogy will be able to solve the mystery. Anyway, good comment. Thank you. And then lastly, here's a comment from about the government, in particular the Federal Reserve or the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, not keeping track of serial numbers of currency that is destroyed after it's been worn out. Obviously, this touches upon the question of whether, if any of the ransom money entered circulation, would it ever be detected. The money was obtained by a local bank that had money set aside just for such purposes. In particular, there was the concern that the bank president might be kidnapped for ransom, so they had the money prepared and a record of the serial numbers in the order that the money was wrapped up into stacks of 100 note bundles. However, the bills were all randomly placed in these stacks, so the list of serial numbers is not in numeric order based on serial numbers, but just the order that they were put into these stacks of currency. Those lists were initially sent to places like casinos and dog tracks where they thought that the skyjacker might try to launder the money, and probably to banks right away, and eventually were published in newspapers to the general public. There were rewards, both official and unofficial, from places like Newsweek magazine, so people did have an incentive to check $20 bills against the list of bills from the ransom, so one would think that out of all the bills, some of them would have been detected in circulation, but none ever were, with the exception of the close to $6,000 that was found at the beach on Tina Bar. Okay, some interesting questions and comments. Thank you very much to everybody. I've gotten a lot more and I'll try to get through them, but it is a very long process to create these fairly simple videos, so please bear with me. If you haven't already, I really would appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything and it helps me out in building a following here. Click the like button on this and my other videos if you like them, and leave a comment in the comment section if you see something that needs commenting upon. Thank you very much.